My name is Brian Donovan, and I'd like to give you a short overview of how to use Find My Past to unlock your Irish family history, or as I prefer to call it, Irish family history is easy. Seriously. Now, you may laugh at that, and I'm sure you're having difficulty, but I want to try and explain to you how much easier it is to do Irish family history than many, many parts of the world. But let's start by looking at what makes Irish genealogy so notoriously difficult. Well, there are four big things. We have record destruction, cultural language, names, and destitution. Let's have a quick look at each of those items. First of all, this is an image seared in the mind of everybody engaged in not just Irish family history, but Irish history in general. It's the destruction of the Public Record Office in Dublin in June 1922 at the start of the Irish Civil War. That destruction caused untold wreckage on this beautiful purpose-built archive that was the Public Record Office. And it meant the loss of the 1821, 31, 41, and 51 censuses, not completely, but almost all of them. Over half the Church of Ireland parish registers, which is quite significant given how high a percentage of the population was not Catholic. All of our wills and court records, centralized ones anyway, and virtually all of our pre-1700 administrative records dating right back to the 12th and 13th century. Now, of course, it wasn't the only disaster to afflict Irish research. We lost our later 19th century census records because of bureaucratic mistakes, and we've lost other records in other circumstances. So record destruction is an issue we can't ignore. But language is also a problem. We tend to forget, living as we do today, that in the 19th century and earlier, a very high percentage of the population, and ultimately the majority of the population, were not English speakers, they were Irish speakers. And so that dual language is really important. This is a very useful map produced by a former Prime Minister, Taoiseach of Ireland, Garret FitzGerald, who did things like this in his spare time. But it's a map of everybody over the age of 60 who was a monoglot Irish speaker and where they lived. And this was in the 1911 census. And his reasoning behind this is that we could then assume that those places were probably predominantly Irish speaking prior to the famine. And look, this is clear division from east and west. It's not just north-south or otherwise, it's east-west. On the eastern half of the country, overwhelmingly English speakers. The western half of the country, overwhelmingly Irish speakers. That's important to keep in mind because that has an impact on many parts of the research, not least of which Irish names. Names which are recorded overwhelmingly by the state and by officialdom who spoke English are recording names which are actually not necessarily of our English origin. Obviously, they're mostly of Irish origin, Gaelic origin. But the Irish are not just Gaelic, or they're a mishmash like every other community in the world. We've come from all over the place and settled in that one island. So a big chunk of the population have Gaelic ancestry. The Irish language, of course, is reflected in that. But we also have a lot of the Irish population have Viking ancestry. The Vikings settled in large numbers in Dublin, particularly, but also in many other parts, and some of the big cities were founded by them. In the medieval period, we had the Normans, the Welsh, the Flemish, the Anglo-Saxons, all moving in as part of the Norman invasion as England expanded outwards to take control of Ireland. Into the later medieval period, in the early modern period, the Scottish started settling in increasing numbers in the north as they took control over parts of those areas. The English started settling then in very large numbers during the plantations under the Tudor and Stuart monarchies as land was confiscated and settled by new settlers. The French came in significant numbers, the Huguenots, German Palatines in the 18th century, Italian families in the 19th century, and of course the big Jewish migration into Ireland in the end of the 19th century, most of whom continued on across the Atlantic. But of course they settled for some time here in Ireland too. And there are many others. And of course today, in the last 25 years, we've had a significant influx of people from all over the world again. So this idea of people moving into Ireland is the norm. The fact that it was stopped for a while is exceptional. So who the hell are the Irish anyway? Well, we can think we know them because of St. Patrick's Day parades and all sorts of other tropes about the Irish. Or we have these typically miserable pictures of the Irish as suffering through famine or otherwise. And these are all very simplistic. They're not necessarily untrue, they're just simplistic. So we need to move beyond that. But another feature which makes Irish genealogy so difficult is poverty. Destitution and poverty. Now, this photo I think, encapsulates just the horror of that totally brilliantly. It's from the wonderful photographic collection in the National Library of Ireland, which are all online, by the way, and they're free. You should go and have a look at them. But impoverishment can lead you to think that there are no records, and that's not always the case. And I want to try and dispel some of these myths. Okay, so let's start looking at records, because that's what this is all about. What records are there to actually try and trace your Irish ancestors? Well, we do have census records, despite what I was saying earlier. We have the 1901 and 1911 census records, which are complete for the entire country, and they're online, and they're free. They're at Find My Past, and they're also on free on the National Archives of Ireland's website and elsewhere. We also have the survivals from the earlier census returns, because while they were mostly destroyed, they survived quite well for parts of the country for 1821, 1841, and 1851. So don't assume that there are no earlier censuses. And the good news about those is they've all been digitized, all been indexed, and they're all available online, again at Find My Past on the National Archives of Ireland's website. We also have replacements or surveys carried out of these census records, which have been used too. So, for example, this is an 1821 survival census for the Aran Islands out in the Irish-speaking west of Ireland. It's in English, but it's still so valuable to have. The entire family of details there, incredibly detailed. We have the census search forms. These are official searches of the census records carried out to support pension applications, because, of course, to get a pension, you had to be over 70. How could you prove that? Well, they went to have a look at census returns to see if they could find evidence of your real age. And then, of course, we do have birth, marriage, and death records. I mean, we may have lost many other records, but our full civil records of birth, marriage, and death do survive. On the downside, of course, they start a little late for Ireland compared to England and Wales or Scotland. They start in 1864. We do have non-Catholic marriages only going back to 1845, but the full system is only in operation from 1864. The great news here about these records is not only are indexes widely available online, but the full scanned images of all the material are available online for free at the irishgenealogy.ie website, which is linked here. And they have got all birth indexes and images complete. All the marriages indexes and images are complete all the way back to 1845. And the death records, the index is complete and images go back to 1871. Now, there is a privacy rule on these records. You can only see births that are more than 100 years old, marriages more than 75, and deaths more than 50. But still wonderful, free. And here's an example of what they look like, the original registers. Isn't it great? And very few other countries have that. But parish registers are so important in Irish research. They're far higher important in Irish research than most because of these other record losses. And Ireland, you've got to remember, was a pluralist society. Now, this is important because we were deeply sectarian. It's true between the different denominations and, of course, state-sponsored sectarianism or otherwise. And there was great discrimination in many places, but people of different denominations lived side by side and they regularly married. And people changed religion. Don't ever think you've always been of the one religion, no matter how far you go back. You almost certainly have people of different denominations in your ancestry in Ireland. And remember, Irish Protestants migrated in proportionally higher numbers, not just the famous Ulster Scots migration in the 18th century, but also those who were Episcopalian, Church of Ireland. They tend to be English speakers. They tend to live in the eastern half of the country, the English speaking part, and they had access to possibly better jobs. They could actually raise a bit of cash. They could actually migrate. So they had access to the bigger towns and cities, so they could get on a boat more easily. Just bear that in mind. Don't assume your ancestors are of any particular denomination until you find the evidence. But we have the Catholic parish registers online thanks to the wonderful work by the National Library of Ireland. They've digitized all of their microfilms of these, and as a consequence, they didn't just digitize the images. They allowed us in Find My Past and others to go and index them and put them online. So we've got nearly 97% of all parish registers, Catholic parish registers in Ireland, are available online for free. All 32 counties, north and south, dating way back to 1670. And it's the most important source we have for Irish research prior to the 1901 census. They look like this. They're a bit scratchy sometimes, these microfilm images. So when we get better ones at Find My Past, we put up color ones, which is brilliant. And our parish registers in Find My Past for Catholic parish registers are free forever. And we fully index them, absolutely fully index them. But of course, as I said before, almost 38% of the population was not Catholic in the 1841 census. So it's a big proportion of the country aren't fitting into that. What's happening with their records? Well, They have the Church of Ireland didn't just keep parish registers; they were responsible for local government administration too. So they have many other records other than parish registers. But their parish registers are overwhelmingly held by the representative church body library in Dublin or by the Public Record Office in Northern Ireland. And the good news is that these wonderful records are being digitized at the moment by both bodies. The representative church body library in Dublin is embarked on a massive project to digitize all their holding of parish registers, which will go up online in due course. In the meantime, I'm delighted to say at Find My Past, we've got one of the biggest collections of Church of Ireland parish register transcripts available, thanks to the extraordinary work of the famous Irish genealogist Rosemary Folliott, who died a number of years ago, but she transcribed an enormous number of parish registers, particularly down in Munster, in Cork, and Limerick, but also many other counties. You'd be surprised how much of the country she travelled transcribing these, and these are all available online at Find My Past. Of course, the Church of Ireland is not the only denomination, but I'll touch on one other, the Quakers, because whilst they're a small community in Ireland today, they were much bigger in the past. Why is that? Well, they overwhelmingly left and went to North America. But they have comprehensive records of the Irish Quakers going back to 1660, births and their marriages, their burials, like you'd find in any denomination, but they also kept extraordinary records of their sufferings, things that bad happened to them, or migration when they moved from place to place, or when they were kicked out of the church, the disownments. I love those. And then books and books of minutes of local meetings, county meetings, right through to provincial meetings and so on. And these are exclusively available in Find My Past. Here's an example from 1795. This is actually a note in a meeting of a member of the group which is moving from Dublin. He was Joshua Fuller Doyle, who's moving from Dublin to Philadelphia. And this is a letter of introduction to the meeting in Philadelphia to introduce them. So we've got some great religious denomination records, parish registers that you can use as well. But in Ireland, I always like people to focus on the fact that there are opportunities in Irish research which you just simply don't have in English research. I like to say that a couple of times, actually, because it's rare that we can say this about Irish research, that sometimes we've got better records. But we do. I mean, we have better records about land and about security. And I'm going to give you a little bit of information about this. First of all, land. Land is one of the big themes in Irish history. Control of land, who occupied land, people being forced from land, like in this, another brilliant picture from the National Library's collection. This is an eviction of somebody who may not have paid rent, or maybe the landlord just simply wants to get rid of them. But the land, an occupation of land, gathered a huge amount of records that you can use. Now, the Valuation Office. People are familiar with their most important work, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the Valuation Office was a creation to try and determine how much rates, taxes, local taxes would be charged on every property in the country. And because of the extraordinary determination of the man in charge, Sir Richard Griffith, it carried out surveys of much higher detail than you generally get. So we have valuation records going back to the 1820s, which gives some of the most important coverage of the Irish population before the famine in any source is here. We have field books, house books, and so many other different types of records. Now, the great news about this is that they're slowly being put online. We at Find My Past have trailblazed this because we actually digitized all of the materials that were on microfilm in the National Archives of Ireland and put online the field and house books for a large chunk of the country. And this is what they look like. They give you the names of the occupiers of these places. It's quite similar types of information to what we find from the most important set of records generated by this body, the Valuation Office, which is well known as the Griffiths Valuation. Now, I'm assuming everybody here is aware of the Griffiths Valuation. It's our most important mid-19th century census substitute for Irish research. But it's an extraordinarily detailed document, and most people don't get the full value out of it. So I'd really dig in and learn about it, because you can determine things about the people who are living there, who they're renting land from the type of land they had, and the type of properties they were living in, all by understanding the valuations. That's something which I'd love to talk more about, but we don't have time today. We also have the Landed Estate Court. Now, Irish estates went into bankruptcy in many cases during the famine period because the tenants couldn't pay. Now, not the biggest issue, you might say. People are starving all over the place. But, of course, the government took this very seriously. So they stepped in to sort things out. and they actually facilitated this process of breaking up the estates and selling them off to try and deal with this through the Landed Estate Court. Why are we interested? Well, because they actually publish rentals of people who are on the land when they sold them. And these rentals are great. They list off all the occupiers of land, the tenure of their occupation of land, and this could deal with some of the poorest people where there's no lease available for their land at all. Here's an example you're looking at here. So land, I've just touched on bits of it. Land is a great opportunity for Irish research, but so is security. And why is that? Well, in simple terms, Ireland was a perpetual pain in the posterior for our nearest neighbour. We had a tendency to launch rebellions. We were deeply unsettled at different times. It was a place of great insecurity for British peace and security. So they took it very seriously. This image here is a photograph of probably Ireland's most notorious prison, Spike Island, which of course where people were actually housed before they were transported to penal colonies abroad. Now, penal colonies are very important. And of course, many of you are sitting there thinking, well, of course, the most famous is Australia. It is. But what was the penal colony before Australia, you might ask yourself? Because, of course, it only started in the 1780s or 1790s. Well, there was a big property that the British had their hands on prior to that, which they used as a penal colony. And yes, you're right, it's now the United States of America. Now, of course, prior to that, that whole process had to stop then, which is why they sought out Australia as the next place to send them. Anyway, what records do we have about security? Let's start with court records. Well, most of our court records were destroyed in 1922, which is a huge shame. But it's not as bad as it might seem for your research, because they were the centralized courts, the county courts, the Court of Sessions at local level, or the assize courts or so on. These courts generally produced interesting enough information to be documented by newspapers in great detail. So don't feel as though you've lost out on those ones. The great news is that the set of court records that did survive are the petty sessions, the lowest court in the land, the ones that would rarely get covered in newspapers. So in this case, we are lucky. We've actually had the survival of the one source we would have chosen if we had to choose one in advance. And the petty sessions records, we have them for all over Ireland, not for the north of Ireland, unfortunately. They haven't been released yet, but for all over what is the Republic of Ireland. And there are more than 600 courts. They cover the entire country, except for Dublin City. They have their own court system, which unfortunately isn't available. And we have 23 million cases were covered by those courts right up to 1918. That's an enormous number. If you think about that in terms of the population of Ireland, we have only 6 million birth records for the same period. We have 23 million court records. They cover criminal and civil law, and they're wonderfully detailed, and they give you a real insight into the activities and the goings on at a local level in Ireland. This is one of the few images we have of what the inside of a petty sessions court looked like. And of course, we have the landlord on the right-hand side presiding in judgment over most things. And we have the recorder on the left who filled in the books, which survive. Now, most of these records only survive after 1851, but many of them do go back earlier. And here's an example from 1834 from Castletownbere in West Cork. And you'll see here, that's a really early date. And we're getting the names of the parties being brought to court. Now here we have Daniel Sullivan of Caherkeen and Daniel Kelly of Allihies. And you find out everything that happened in their court case at a time when there might not even be parish registers. So very useful. We also have the dog license books, which were issued, dog licenses by petty sessions. And you may laugh to yourself, well, we're not tracing dogs. No, but we are tracing their owners. And these registers are on dog licenses tell you all about the owners. They tell you their name, their address, the date that they took out a license. They tell you that the type of dog they got a license for. And when you're lucky, in the remarks column, you'll find out the name of the dog. Now, I don't know how many family trees actually allow you to put in a family pet, but that would be a nice thing to add, wouldn't it? But after the courts, of course, people ended up in prison. And bear in mind, we had twice as many prisons and twice as many courts as they did in England and Scotland and Wales. And there's a good reason for that, as I've just mentioned. And our prison registers survived from the 1790s onwards, and most of them are in the National Archives of Ireland. And I had the privilege of digitizing this material, like the petty sessions, some years ago. And there are over 2.7 million prisoners mentioned in these records. And the registers themselves can be incredibly detailed. Now, they do vary over time. They get more detailed as you go forward in time. But you actually get names, you get an entire physical description, heights, weights, eye color, hair color. You find out their occupation, you find out their next of kin, where they live, and all the details of their case and so on. So they're incredibly detailed. Again, all indexed, all available online. martial law. Ireland was put under martial law so many times during the 19th and early 20th century because, again, we were constantly in competition or raising revolt. And this is when the army takes control of the judicial system. And there's an enormous number of records that exist around this. And again, I had the privilege of digitizing and indexing these records with Find My Past some years ago. To give you an idea of how detailed they are, we have search and raid reports by the army during the War of Independence in Ireland in the 19-teens, which give an entire household breakdown of the people living in houses. Now, again, it doesn't cover the entire country, but if you're lucky enough, it might cover your family. So check these out. Now, for those of you who think the poor and the oppressed of Ireland are impossible to trace because of their destitution, paradoxically, searching for them is easier than might otherwise be the case because of the records generated by the state's poor relief services. They were very basic, very minimal, but they did have them. And because of that, we have records of the poor law system. These are the poor law unions. We have workhouse registers online now by Find My Past for Donegal, Dublin, Sligo. We have the Board of Guardian minute books. These are the supporting records by the people in charge of them for all of the counties listed here. Now, of course, there's many more counties to go for. And bear in mind that many county libraries in Ireland have done their own projects, particularly for Limerick, for Tipperary, Wexford, Wicklow, and others. So check those out, those county libraries or county archives as well, because you may find some records that we don't have there too. So very useful. This is what the inside of a workhouse looked like, but the people were clamoring to get inside during the famine, I'll tell you. Unfortunately, there were nowhere near the number of places to be. But the records are very, very detailed. Here's an example for Sligo in 1854, or here's Dublin in 1898, where you get all sorts of details about the inmates as they come in through the workhouses. And you remember those Board of Guardian minute books I talked about? Well, they can often tell you individual case stories. Like these are examples of applications for people to migrate to Australia and to America. And you get the details of the individuals who are being assisted with their migration. And if you are searching for the poor who are trying to leave Ireland, bear in mind they might have actually gone into a workhouse in Liverpool. Liverpool, we often jokingly say, is the biggest city in Ireland. I know it's in England, but of course it was so heavily settled by Irish people. So you see a number of Irish people ending up in the workhouse in Liverpool, who often thereafter go and get their shipping, because the major shipping from Britain and Ireland to America came through Liverpool. And these detailed cases, you'll see examples here. This is of a Bridget Murphy. She's age 28 and she's got her baby John, who's 2 weeks old, and they're admitted in 1845, discharged, and then sent back to Ireland. So these things are really important, these records. And in cases in the Liverpool workhouses, the entire Roman Catholic children sitting in the workhouse were shipped to Canada in 1887. And they give you the name, age, and details of foster parents there. More on the poor. We have the Irish Poverty Relief Loans, which was a philanthropic fund to help out the poor prior to the famine. And from those areas you can see here on the map. And they are extraordinarily detailed, right up into charting the numbers of people who died during the famine and who received relief. So there's an awful lot about the poor. So don't feel as though it's impossible because they were so poor. And then bear in mind, newspapers are a phenomenally important source for Irish research like everybody else, but even more so in Ireland. And why? Because in Ireland, we got national education in the 1820s, almost 40 years before they got it in England. They always tried out new and fangled ideas in Ireland first before trying them out in England. Because of that, and this may shock you, Irish migrants to America generally could read and write, whereas their English counterparts couldn't. And that meant that the Irish were more employable when they got to America, the poor Irish, that is, so like compared to the poor English. And because Irish could read and write, there was a much more vibrant trade for Irish newspapers than you might otherwise think. And of course, Irish newspapers, like newspapers everywhere in the world, record what's going on locally. Thankfully, because of the British Newspaper Archive, which is owned by Find My Past, we've got the largest collection of 19th century Irish newspapers there are online, anywhere. So please look at that and use those resources. Here's an example of the Clare Journal, which was dating from 1854. And as you can see, it's just covered in adverts for migration out to America, out to Australia, going to Canada. The country is clearing out. So look at newspapers as a valuable source. So you see, it's easy. Irish family history is indeed easy. It's about time too. Thank you very much.